It started on a Thursday, the kind of Thursday where the world moved at its usual pace, unremarkable and steady. I remember it clearly, not because there was anything extraordinary about the day, but because of how it ended, how it shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. My name is Daniel Miller. I'm 32 years old, a marketing consultant by trade, and I've always prided myself on being the kind of guy who plays by the rules. Work hard, provide for your family, be a good husband. That was the blueprint I followed, even when life threw its punches, and believe me, it did. But nothing could have prepared me for this punch. I came home that night at 7:36 p.m., later than usual. The scent of chicken Alfredo lingered faintly in the air, a remnant of the dinner I had missed. The table was cleared, the dishes done, a habit of hers when I was running late. I hung my keys on the hook by the door and paused, listening. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. No sound of the TV, no clinking of dishes in the kitchen. I made my way upstairs, my footsteps softened by the carpet. As I passed the half-open bedroom door, I caught sight of her. Emma, my wife of 8 years. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me. Her blonde hair was pulled into a loose bun, strands of it framing her face. She was still dressed in the same cream-colored blouse and black pencil skirt she'd worn to work that morning, but her shoulders were tense, her posture rigid. "Hey," I said, stepping inside. "Everything okay?" She didn't answer right away. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and I noticed how her wedding ring caught the light. It wasn't like her to be this quiet. Emma had always been outspoken, vibrant, the kind of woman who filled a room just by being in it. Finally, she turned to look at me, her hazel eyes clouded with something I couldn't quite place. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. I felt a flicker of unease in my chest, but I forced a smile. "Sure. What's going on?" She stood then, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. She was beautiful even now, perhaps especially now, with her emotions so raw and unguarded. But there was something else in her expression, something that set every nerve in my body on edge. "I've been seeing someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The world seemed to tilt, and for a moment, I thought I might have misheard her. "What?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the truth in her eyes. "I've been seeing someone else, Daniel." The words hit me like a freight train, and I stumbled back a step, my hand bracing against the doorframe. My mind raced, trying to process what she'd just said. This was Emma. My Emma. The woman who laughed at my terrible jokes, who cried with me when we lost our first pregnancy, who whispered promises to me beneath a canopy of stars on our wedding night. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. "Who?" I managed to choke out, my voice hoarse. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. But when she spoke, the name she uttered felt like a dagger to my chest. "It's Richard." Richard, my boss. The man I had spent years trying to impress. The man who had mentored me, who had praised my work ethic and told me I was destined for greatness. The man who had been to my house for dinner, who had toasted to my promotion just last month. I felt a sickening wave of betrayal wash over me, followed by a surge of anger so intense it made my hands tremble. "How long?" I asked, my voice shaking. 6 months, she admitted, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It just happened." It just happened. The words echoed in my mind, absurd and infuriating. Nothing like this just happens. It takes choices, deliberate, selfish choices. And she had made them, over and over again. "What the hell does that even mean, Emma?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You've been lying to me for 6 months? Sleeping with my boss? What the hell is wrong with you?" She flinched at my tone but quickly straightened, her own anger bubbling to the surface. "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with you, Daniel? You're stuck in this dead-end job, living paycheck to paycheck, while I'm drowning in mediocrity with you. I deserve more than this, more than you." Her words were like gasoline on the fire already burning inside me. "So what? You cheat on me, and that's supposed to fix everything? That's supposed to make you feel better about your life?" "It's not just about me," she shot back. "It's about us, or maybe the lack of us. When was the last time you even looked at me like you used to? When was the last time you made me feel like I was enough?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment I saw the vulnerability beneath her anger. But it wasn't enough to soften the blow of her betrayal. Nothing could soften that. "I gave you everything, Emma." I stood there in the doorway, my body numb, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. Divorce. The word echoed in my mind like a relentless drumbeat. 8 years of marriage. Gone. Erased in an instant with a single word. Searched her face for any sign of regret, any flicker of the woman I thought I knew, the woman I loved. But she looked back at me with a cold determination, as though she had already rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind. "You want a divorce?" I repeated, my voice hollow, barely my own. "Yes," she said, her tone firm. "It's for the best. For the best." The words tasted bitter on my tongue. I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to steady myself, trying not to lash out, even as my entire world crumbled around me. "For the best?" I spat. "How the hell is tearing apart our life for the best, Emma? For you? For him?" Her eyes darted away, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw guilt flicker across her face. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a stony resolve. "For both of us, Daniel. We're not happy. We haven't been for a long time." I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that came from humor. It was sharp, bitter, and tinged with despair. "You don't get to decide that for me," I said, my voice shaking. "You don't get to burn our marriage to the ground and call it a favor." She took a step toward me then, her expression softening, but I backed away. I didn't want her sympathy, her pity. Not now, not ever. "Daniel, I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter now. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I didn't mean to hurt you." I stared at her, incredulous. "You didn't mean to hurt me? You're leaving me for my boss, Emma. You've been cheating on me for 6 months. How do you not mean to hurt me?" Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out. And in that moment, I realized something. She wasn't going to fight for us. She wasn't going to apologize or beg for forgiveness. She had already made her choice, and that choice wasn't me. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a lead blanket. The house was silent, oppressive, and every corner of it reminded me of her, of us. The framed photos on the mantel, the throw pillows she insisted on buying, the faint scent of her perfume still lingering in the air. I thought about calling someone. My brother, maybe, or one of my college friends. But what was I supposed to say? "Hey, my wife cheated on me and called me a loser. How's your day going?" No. This was my battle to face alone, at least for now. At some point, I found myself staring at my reflection in the darkened TV screen. My face was drawn, my eyes bloodshot, my hair a disheveled mess. I didn't even recognize the man looking back at me. When had I become this shell? When had I lost myself? And then her words came rushing back to me, sharp and cruel. "You're stuck in this dead-end job, living paycheck to paycheck. I deserve more than this, more than you." Was that what she really thought of me? A broke loser? Someone not worth staying with? My chest tightened, anger and humiliation bubbling to the surface. I thought about all the late nights I spent working. Over time, the weekends I gave up to make sure we had enough. I thought about the sacrifices, the compromises, the dreams I put on hold because we were supposed to be a team. But apparently, that wasn't enough for her. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a fire in my chest. I wasn't going to let her or Richard define me. If she thought I was a loser, fine. But I wasn't going to stay one. I dragged myself into the shower, the cold water shocking me awake. As I stood there, the anger began to transform into something else: determination. I wasn't going to let her betrayal break me. If anything, it was going to fuel me. I spent the rest of the day making calls. First to a lawyer, because if she wanted a divorce, I wasn't going to roll over and make it easy for her. Then to a recruiter, letting them know I was open to new opportunities. And finally to my old friend Marcus, who had been bugging me for years to join his startup. "You serious this time?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "Because last time we talked, you were all about loyalty to your company." I glanced at the framed photo of Richard and me shaking hands at last year's holiday party. I picked it up, stared at it for a moment, and then hurled it into the trash. "I'm serious," I said. "Let's talk." The next week was a blur of action, but for the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't running in circles. I was focused. I was angry, yes. But that anger had crystallized into something productive, a drive to claw my way out of the wreckage and prove to myself that I was more than the man Emma had dismissed. Marcus and I met for coffee in a small cafe downtown. He hadn't changed much since our college days, still the same quick wit and restless energy that made him impossible to keep up with. But now there was an edge to him, a confidence born from success. His tech startup had taken off over the past 2 years, and he was eager to bring me on board. "Look, Dan," he said, leaning across the table, "I know you're going through a lot right now, but this could be a fresh start. I need someone with your skills, someone I can trust. You'll have creative control, a decent stake in the company, and best of all, no one breathing down your neck." I took a sip of my coffee, letting his words sink in. It was a risk. No doubt about it. But wasn't that the point? Staying in my comfort zone had gotten me nowhere. Emma's betrayal had forced me to confront a bitter truth. I'd been playing it safe for too long. "I'm in," I said finally, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something resembling hope. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the new job. The hours were grueling, the pressure immense, but I thrived under it. Every late night at the office, every pitch meeting, every challenge, it was like I was proving something to myself, piece by piece. I wasn't just rebuilding my career, I was reclaiming my identity. And then there was Emma. She had moved out 2 days after dropping the divorce bombshell, leaving behind a hollow, echoing house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. We communicated only through lawyers, and even those exchanges were terse. Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but what was the point? She'd made her choice. Still, she lingered in the corners of my mind, a shadow I couldn't quite shake. Late at night, when the world was quiet and my defenses were down, I'd replay our last conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every expression. How had we gotten here? Was there something I'd missed, some warning sign I'd ignored? Or had she changed into someone I no longer recognized right under my nose? One evening, a month into my new job, Marcus invited me to a networking event at a sleek downtown bar. It was the kind of place Emma would have loved: dim lighting, overpriced cocktails, and an air of exclusivity. As I stepped inside, I felt a pang of irony. If she could see me now, rubbing elbows with investors and entrepreneurs, would she still call me a loser? I was nursing a whiskey at the bar, half listening to a conversation about venture capital when I saw her. Emma. And she wasn't alone. She walked in with Richard, my former boss. Her arm looped through his like they were the stars of some romantic movie. My stomach tightened, and for a moment, I considered slipping out before she noticed me. But then I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror behind the bar. I was wearing a tailored suit, my posture confident, my presence commanding. This wasn't the broken man she'd left behind. No. If she wanted to flaunt her choices, I wasn't going to shy away. I turned back to my drink, my heart pounding but my expression calm. It didn't take long for her to spot me. Her steps faltered, and for a split second I saw something in her eyes, shock, maybe even regret. But she recovered quickly, plastering on a smile as she approached with Richard in tow. "Daniel," she said, her voice smooth but strained, "this is unexpected." "Emma, Richard." I nodded at them, my tone polite but distant. Small world. Richard had the audacity to extend his hand, but I ignored it, focusing instead on Emma. She looked different, her hair styled in loose waves, her makeup more dramatic than I remembered. She was trying to project confidence, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her hand as she adjusted her bracelet. "So," she said, glancing at the people around me, "what brings you here?" I took a slow sip of my drink, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "Work," I said simply. "Marcus and I are building something big. It's been keeping me busy." Her eyes widened, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She hadn't expected this. She'd expected me to be floundering, licking my wounds, not thriving. Richard cleared his throat, clearly eager to change the subject. "Well, it's good to see you, Daniel. I hope there are no hard feelings." I met his gaze, my smile razor sharp. "Oh, none at all. In fact, I should thank you. You gave me the push I needed to make some changes. It's funny how things work out." He shifted uncomfortably, but before he could respond, Marcus appeared at my side. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of transformation. It wasn't just about the job or the hours spent crafting a vision with Marcus. It was about finding the parts of myself I'd buried under years of complacency. For too long, I'd let the weight of expectations, fear of failure, and Emma's veiled criticisms define me. Now I was building a new narrative, one where I wasn't just a supporting character in someone else's story. Still, late nights had a way of pulling at old wounds. I'd sit in my quiet apartment, smaller, colder, and emptier than the home Emma and I once shared, trying to drown the silence with work. Yet, every so often, I'd find myself staring at the documents spread across the table, my pen hovering uselessly over a notepad. The ache wasn't constant, but it had a way of sneaking up, coiling itself around me like an invisible chain. How did it come to this? The thought echoed in my mind like a drumbeat some nights. How had the woman who once looked at me like I was her entire world reduced me to nothing? I'd shake my head, muttering a curse under my breath. Enough. She wasn't going to win, not in my head, not in my heart, and definitely not in the life I was rebuilding. It was during one of those long nights that Marcus called me. "Dan, I need you at this conference tomorrow," he said without preamble, his tone as sharp as always. "Big players, potential investors, the whole shebang. You in?" I hesitated. It wasn't that I wasn't ready, I was, and I knew it, but a part of me still flinched at the thought of walking into those rooms, rubbing shoulders with people who might dismiss me outright. "Dan." Marcus's voice pulled me back. "Yeah," I said, sitting up straighter. "I'll be there." The conference was a glittering affair. People dressed in crisp suits and designer dresses moved about the spacious hall, their voices a low hum beneath the clinking of glasses and the occasional burst of laughter. I adjusted my tie as I stepped into the room, taking a deep breath. Marcus was already mingling, a drink in hand and his charm in full force. He spotted me almost immediately and waved me over. "About time," he said, grinning as he handed me a glass of champagne. "Ready to dazzle?" I smiled, though my nerves were still buzzing beneath the surface. "Let's do this." And so I did. I talked. I pitched. I charmed. I answered every question thrown at me with confidence, my words backed by the hard work. I'd poured into our project. By the end of the night, I'd secured meetings with 3 potential investors and even caught the interest of a well-known industry leader. For the first time in years, I felt alive, like I was standing tall, on my own 2 feet, the weight of my past no longer dragging me down. But life has a funny way of testing you, doesn't it? As the crowd began to thin and Marcus and I stood near the bar celebrating our success, my eyes landed on a familiar figure across the room, Emma. She hadn't seen me yet, but I couldn't miss her. She was wearing a sleek black dress, her hair styled perfectly, her laughter ringing out as she chatted with a small group of people. And then, as if fate had a cruel sense of humor, Richard stepped into view, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay composed. She wasn't here for me, and I wasn't here for her. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, his eyes following my gaze. "Fine," I said quickly, turning back to him. "Let's get out of here." But before we could leave, Emma's eyes found mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Her smile faltered, her expression shifting into something I couldn't quite read. Guilt? Surprise? Regret? I straightened, offering her the faintest nod before turning away. I didn't owe her anything. Not a word, not a glance, not a single moment of my time. Let her see me now, I thought. Let her see the man she underestimated. Would you like the story to delve deeper into this moment, or explore what happens in Daniel's life after this confrontation? The moment lingered in the air like the fading notes of a haunting melody. I felt her eyes burning into my back as Marcus and I made our way toward the exit. My heartbeat was steady, but there was a quiet storm in my chest, a mix of triumph, defiance, and an unspoken pain I refused to acknowledge. "Do you know her?" Marcus asked casually, keeping pace beside me. I hesitated for a beat. Not anymore. Marcus didn't press. He wasn't the type. He simply nodded as if to say, "Fair enough," and held the door open for me. The cool night air washed over us as we stepped outside, grounding me in the present. "You killed it in there tonight," Marcus said, lighting a cigarette and offering me one. I waved it off, but his words settled something inside me. "Thanks," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. The drive home was silent, save for the hum of the car engine, but my mind was anything but still. I couldn't help replaying the look on Emma's face when she saw me, the way her confident smile had faltered, the way she'd hesitated, almost as if she wanted to say something. What did you expect? I thought bitterly. An apology? A confession? Closure? None of it mattered. I'd moved on, or at least I was trying to, but fate wasn't done with me yet. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee and prepared for another day of grinding away at this new chapter of my life, my phone buzzed. A message from Emma. My stomach tightened as I stared at the screen, her name glaring back at me like a ghost I hadn't quite exorcised. Against my better judgment, I opened it. "Emma, can we talk?" I set the phone down, leaning back in my chair as 1,000 thoughts flooded my mind. Talk? About what? The affair? The divorce? The way you tore me down and left me for dead while you moved on with my boss? No. She didn't get to do this. Not now, not after everything. But as much as I wanted to ignore her, to let her message rot in the digital void, a part of me, a small, stubborn, masochistic part, wanted to hear what she had to say. Against My better judgment, I agreed to meet her later that evening at a small cafe downtown. She was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window with a latte in front of her hands nervously clasped around the cup. She looked different, smaller, somehow. Not the confident, calculating woman who'd once called me a broke loser before walking out of my life. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, but I kept my expression neutral, sliding into the seat across from her. "Dan," she began, her voice softer than I remembered. I held up a hand, stopping her before she could go any further. "Let's not waste time, Emma. You wanted to talk, so talk." She flinched at the sharpness in my tone, but nodded. "You're right. I owe you an apology." The words hung between us like a fragile bridge. "I made a mistake," she continued, her eyes downcast. "A lot of mistakes. I was selfish, and I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to justify. I thought I was chasing happiness, but—" She trailed off, her voice breaking slightly. "I was wrong." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "And now you're what? Looking for forgiveness? Redemption?" "No," she said quickly, her gaze meeting mine for the first time. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Dan. I needed you to know that I regret everything. Losing you was the biggest mistake of my life." Her words should have meant something. They should have sparked anger or relief or something. But all I felt was a strange, hollow indifference. "Emma," I said, my voice steady, "I spent years trying to be enough for you, trying to prove that I was worth your love, your respect. And when you left, you didn't just break my heart. You shattered the person I was." She looked away, tears glistening in her eyes. "But you know what?" I continued, leaning forward. "You did me a favor. Losing you forced me to find myself again, to rebuild. And for that, I thank you." She blinked, her tears spilling over as she whispered, "I'm so sorry, Dan." I stood, tossing a few bills on the table to cover the coffee I hadn't even ordered. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Emma, but it's not me." And with that, I walked away, the weight of her betrayal finally lifting from my shoulders. Chapter 2. A glimpse of her world, I leaned against the bar after Daniel left, his words echoing in my head. "Goodbye, Emma." It was the finality of it that struck me, a door slammed shut. And yet here I was, staring at the glass in my hands, as though it held some kind of answer. The truth was, I hadn't expected to see him. When Angela invited me to this mixer, I'd thought it might be a chance to network, maybe distract myself from the chaos my life had become. Instead, fate had brought me face to face with the man whose life I'd shattered. Daniel looked so different, confident, grounded. There was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a self-assurance I hadn't recognized in the man I used to call my husband. And then there was me. I caught my reflection in the mirror behind the bar. My hair, usually perfectly styled, looked a little disheveled. My lipstick was faded, and the dress I'd chosen so carefully now felt like armor that didn't quite fit. "Another drink?" the bartender asked, snapping me out of my thoughts. Nodded, handing over my empty glass. As he poured, I felt someone slide into the seat beside me. "Emma, didn't think I'd see you here." I turned to find Angela, my friend and sometimes confidant, with a raised eyebrow and a glass of champagne in hand. She was effortlessly poised, her sleek black dress hugging her figure like it was made for her and her alone. Neither did I admitted, forcing a smile. Angela's eyes narrowed. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated, glancing toward the crowd. Daniel was nowhere in sight, but his presence lingered like a whisper in the back of my mind. "I saw him," I said finally. "Him?" Angela frowned, and then her expression softened with realization. "Daniel, I nodded, taking a sip of my fresh drink. Angela sighed, leaning closer. You knew this would happen eventually. You're bound to run into him, especially since... She stopped herself, but the weight of her words hung between us. Since what? I pressed, my voice sharper than I intended. Since he's been making waves, Angela said carefully. Everyone's talking about his new projects, Emma. He's not the same man he was when you... When I what? I snapped, my frustration bubbling to the surface. When I hurt him? When I made the worst mistake of my life? Angela didn't flinch. She never did. That was one of the reasons I kept her around. She had a way of grounding me even when I didn't want to hear the truth. Yes, she said simply. And now he's thriving. Good for him. I looked away, swallowing the lump in my throat. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I smiled and chatted with strangers, pretending to care about their stories and ambitions. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment with Daniel. By the time I got home, it was past midnight. The apartment was dark and quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I kicked off my heels, leaving them haphazardly by the door, and collapsed onto the couch. This was my life now. No Daniel, no love, just me, my regrets, and an empty apartment that felt like a monument to my mistakes. As I sat there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, was this it? Was this all I deserved? He looked happy. The thought burned, twisting in my chest like a knife. I reached for my phone, scrolling aimlessly through my contacts. My finger hovered over his name, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. What would I even say? The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. My head throbbed slightly, probably from the wine, and my heart felt heavy. But something had shifted. I wasn't sure what it was, but as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair, I saw a spark of determination in my reflection. Maybe it wasn't too late to fix things. Not with Daniel. No, that bridge was well and truly burned, but with myself. As I left the cafe, the cold evening air embraced me like a quiet companion, calming the turmoil Emma's words had stirred. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. Instead, I felt lighter, as if setting down a heavy burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Her apology, while unexpected, was a chapter I didn't know I needed to close. Walking toward my car, I noticed how life seemed indifferent to our personal storms. People moved around me, laughing, arguing, living their lives as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath my feet. It was humbling and grounding. The sound of my phone vibrating in my pocket interrupted my thoughts. Pulling it out, I saw Marcus's name flashing on the screen. Yo, man, his voice came through with its usual laid-back tone. You're coming to the mixer tonight, right? Big networking opportunity. I hesitated. My first instinct was to decline. After all, I wasn't in the mood to socialize, but then I thought about it. The old me, the version of Daniel that Emma had known, would have stayed home, wallowing in self-doubt. The new me, the man I was becoming, needed to show up. Yeah, I replied, surprising even myself. I'll be there. Good. Dress sharp. See you at 8. The venue was buzzing with energy by the time I arrived. A rooftop bar with strings of lights casting a warm glow over the crowd. The scent of cologne, perfume, and expensive cocktails filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of jazz playing in the background. I took a moment to scan the room, spotting familiar faces from the industry. This wasn't just a social event. It was an arena. Deals would be made here, alliances formed, futures shaped. Marcus waved me over, standing in a circle with a few colleagues. He introduced me to them, and I shook hands, exchanging pleasantries. But then, as if fate couldn't resist one last twist, I saw her. Emma. She was standing near the bar, looking out of place in this crowd of polished professionals. Her gaze swept the room until it landed on me. For a moment, neither of us moved. What was she doing here? Before I could decide whether to approach her or ignore her entirely, Marcus clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Dan, come meet Mr. Harding." I tore my eyes away from Emma and turned toward Marcus. Mr. Harding was an older man, sharply dressed and exuding authority. This was the kind of connection I needed. "Daniel Wright," I said, extending my hand. "It's a pleasure." "Likewise," Harding replied, his grip firm. "Marcus has been singing your praises. I hear you're working on some exciting projects." As we talked, I found myself relaxing, slipping into the confident version of myself I'd been working so hard to cultivate. Harding seemed genuinely interested, and by the time we parted ways, he'd given me his card and an invitation to pitch my ideas to his team. The night was shaping up to be a success, but Emma was still there. An hour later, I found myself at the bar ordering a drink, and there she was, sliding into the seat next to me. "Daniel," she said softly. I didn't look at her immediately. Instead, I took a sip of my whiskey, letting the silence stretch between us. "What are you doing here, Emma?" I asked, finally, my tone neutral. She hesitated, and for a moment she seemed unsure of herself. "I came to see you." I turned to face her, raising an eyebrow. "You followed me here?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I didn't know you'd be here. I was invited by a friend. But when I saw you—" She trailed off, her eyes searching mine. I sighed, setting my glass down. "Emma, we've already had this conversation. What more is there to say?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect you to be doing so well. You look happy, successful, like you've moved on." Her words struck a chord, but not in the way she intended. "I am," I said simply. Emma nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm glad," she said after a moment, though her voice carried a hint of something else. Regret, perhaps. We sat in silence for a while, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. "Goodbye, Emma," I said finally, standing and leaving her at the bar. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't haunted by the past. Emma's presence no longer felt like a shadow looming over me. I'd reclaimed my life. And this time, I wasn't. Looking back. Chapter 3. The World He Built Without Me. The morning after seeing Daniel was an unsettling haze. I found myself staring at my phone more often than I cared to admit, scrolling through old photos of us that I hadn't deleted. Not because I couldn't let go, but because I had convinced myself they were simply memories. Each picture told a story of who we used to be. His smile, unguarded and full of warmth. My laugh caught mid-motion, leaning into his shoulder as though the entire world rested there. It was a different life. One I had taken for granted in ways I could never undo. Angela's words lingered in my head. "Everyone's talking about his new projects, Emma. He's not the same man." My curiosity was a moth to the flame. A quick search of his name confirmed what Angela had hinted at. Article after article painted the picture of a man reborn. Daniel Ellis, the rising star of real estate development. From humble beginnings to high-rise dreams. There were photos of him standing in front of sleek new buildings, shaking hands with city officials, and even gracing the cover of a business magazine, his name in bold above the tagline, "Reinventing Success." I stared at one photo longer than I should have. He was dressed in a tailored suit, a hint of stubble softening his jawline. His expression was confident, almost defiant. There was no trace of the man who used to second-guess himself, who used to look to me for reassurance. And beside him in one photo was a woman. She was stunning, tall, with sleek auburn hair and an air of effortless elegance. The caption identified her as Sophie Bennett, Partner and COO. Partner. The word felt heavier than it should have, though I knew it probably referred to business. Probably. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding in my chest. Later that day, Angela called. "I was just thinking about you," she said breezily. "How are you holding up?" "I looked him up," I admitted. Angela sighed, a mix of exasperation and concern. "Emma, I told you about his success to prepare you, not to send you spiraling. What were you hoping to find?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Closure, maybe, or proof that he's doing better without me. Something to justify everything." "Justify what?" Angela pressed. "That I was right to leave," I whispered, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Angela was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler. "Emma, you didn't leave him because you thought he couldn't succeed. You left because you were scared. Scared of stagnating, scared of what your life would look like if you stayed. Own that." Her words hit like a cold splash of water. She wasn't wrong. I had been scared. Scared of losing myself in a life. That felt too small for my ambitions, too ordinary for my dreams. But now, as I looked around my empty apartment, I couldn't help but wonder, what had those dreams really cost me? That evening, I decided to attend a charity gala Angela had invited me 2 weeks ago. I needed a distraction, something to pull me out of my own head. The venue was lavish, filled with the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, and the soft hum of classical music mingled with the murmur of conversations. I was sipping a glass of champagne when I saw him. Daniel. He stood near the stage, talking to a group of people. His posture was relaxed, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing as he spoke. He looked completely at ease, as though he belonged in this world. And then I saw her. Sophie. She was by his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she laughed at something he said. My stomach twisted and I turned away, hoping to blend into the crowd. "Emma?" His voice froze me in place. I turned slowly, plastering on a smile that I hoped didn't betray the storm brewing inside me. "Daniel?" I said, my voice steady. "Fancy seeing you here?" He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's a small world, I guess." Sophie appeared beside him, her presence magnetic. She extended a hand with a polite smile. "Hi, I'm Sophie. You must be Emma." There was no malice in her tone, no judgment, just genuine curiosity. It almost made me feel worse. "Nice to meet you," I said, shaking her hand. Daniel cleared his throat. "Sophie, could you give us a moment?" Sophie hesitated, her eyes flicking between us, but she nodded. "Of course, I'll be by the bar." As she walked away, Daniel turned his attention back to me. "You seem different," he said after a pause. "Do I?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He nodded. "I don't know. There's something in your eyes, like you're searching for something. But maybe you always were." His words cut deeper than he probably intended. "And you?" I countered. "You seem whole." Daniel smiled, but there was a trace of sadness in it. "I've worked hard to get here." "I can see that," I said softly. "You've built something incredible." "Thank you," he said. Chapter 4. Bridges of glass. Stared at Daniel, the words I wanted to say dancing just beyond my reach. Time hadn't softened the edges of our shared history, but it had given me perspective. Yet standing here, face to face with the man I once loved, I couldn't decide if I wanted to bridge the gap between us or if I even deserved to. "Why did you really come tonight, Emma?" Daniel asked, his tone measured but curious. I hesitated. The room around us was bustling with movement and laughter, yet I felt as if we were in a vacuum, the rest of the world muted. "I didn't know you'd be here," I admitted. "But maybe I was hoping to run into you, to see if—" I trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. "To see if I'm miserable without you?" he offered, his smile sharp and knowing. My cheeks flushed. "No, to see if you're happy," I said, honestly, "and to figure out if there's anything left between us worth salvaging." His expression softened, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw the Daniel I used to know. The man who used to bring me coffee in bed, who used to trace patterns on my back as we planned our future late into the night. "Emma," he said, his voice low, "I don't think either of us is the same person we were back then. Do you?" I shook my head, the weight of his words settling on my chest. He was right. The woman standing in front of him wasn't the same one who had walked away from our life together. And he was so far removed from the man who had once looked at me like I was his entire world. But did that mean we couldn't find each other again? "I don't know," I said finally. "I think that's what scares me the most." Later that night, as the gala began to wind down, I found myself outside on the balcony, the crisp air biting at my skin. I leaned against the railing, looking out at the city skyline. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Daniel. "Couldn't stay in there either, huh?" I said, trying to inject some levity into the moment. He smiled faintly. "Needed some air, and I figured you'd be out. Here." I glanced at him, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with unspoken thoughts, memories, regrets. "Do you ever think about us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But mostly, I think about what we could have been. If things had been different." I nodded, my throat tight. "Emma," he said, turning to face me fully. "Why now? Why come back into my life when I've finally figured out how to move on?" His words were like a punch to the gut, but I knew he wasn't trying to hurt me. He was just tired. Tired of reopening old wounds. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe I needed to see for myself that you're okay. That you're better without me." His gaze softened. "I didn't get better because of you, or in spite of you. I got better because I had to. For me." The lump in my throat grew. "I'm glad, Daniel. I really am." As the night came to an end, I felt a strange sense of closure begin to take root. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything magically fell into place. But it was real. We weren't the same people we had been, and that was okay. For the first time, I let myself hope, not for a rekindling of what was, but for the possibility of what could be. Whether that was with Daniel or not, I didn't know, but I was ready to find out. Chapter 5. The slow work of repair. The days after the gala felt like a strange limbo. I'd gone in expecting answers, maybe even some form of absolution. But what I'd left with was far more ambiguous. Daniel's words stayed with me, playing, on a loop in my mind. I got better because I had to. For me. I envied that clarity, that resolve. I'd spent so much of the last few years trying to outrun the guilt and regret that I'd forgotten how to stand still long enough to face them. But the gala had cracked something open in me. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about the version of myself I'd left behind when I walked away from our marriage. Could I ever find her again? It started with small steps. I reached out to Daniel a week after the gala, sending a tentative message. "Would you be open to grabbing coffee sometime? No pressure. Just to talk." The dots that signaled he was typing flickered on and off for what felt like an eternity. Finally, his reply came. "Coffee sounds fine. Let's meet at that place on Main Street, where we used to go. Saturday. At 10? I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The cafe on Main Street had been our spot, a tiny place tucked away from the bustle of the city. It was where we'd had our first date, where we'd celebrated promotions and birthdays, where we'd dreamed up the life we'd wanted to build together. "See you then?" I replied, my fingers trembling as I hit send. Saturday arrived with a mix of nerves and cautious hope. I arrived early, taking a seat by the window. The cafe looked almost the same, but there were subtle changes. A new menu board, different chairs. When Daniel walked in, I felt a rush of emotions I couldn't fully name. He looked good, better than I remembered. His hair was shorter, and he carried himself with an ease that hadn't been there before. "Hey," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "Hey." We ordered our drinks, and for a moment the conversation felt stilted, like two strangers trying to find common ground. But then he asked, "So, how've you been?" And just like that, the walls began to come down. We talked for hours, about work, about friends, about the paths our lives had taken since the divorce. I told him about the nonprofit I'd started, how it had been both a lifeline and a challenge. He shared stories about his job, his travels, his family. There was laughter, real, unforced laughter, and moments of quiet reflection. At one point, I said, "I never really apologized, for everything I put you through." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I think I spent a long time waiting for an apology," he admitted. But eventually, I realized I didn't need one to move on. The honesty in his voice hit me like a tidal wave. "I'm still sorry," I said, my voice cracking, "for the betrayal, for the way I handled things. You deserved better." "I did," he said simply. But there was no malice in his tone, only a quiet acceptance. "And maybe you did too." As we left the cafe, I felt lighter somehow, as if a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. "Thanks for meeting me," I said as we stood by the curb. He nodded. "Take care of yourself, Emma." I watched him walk away, unsure of what the future held for us, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. This wasn't the end of our story. It wasn't a dramatic reunion or a clean break. It was something in between, a chance to heal, to grow, to figure out what came next. And that was enough. Chapter 6. The Unraveling of Emma. It was the silence that settled in after that meeting, the quiet that was both comforting and unsettling, that began to unspool something inside of me. Seeing Daniel again, hearing him speak with that calm assurance about his life without me, stirred something in me I wasn't ready to confront. I'd told myself I had moved on, that the life I'd built after everything was enough to fill the void. But now, with the weight of our past hovering between us, I realized how much I'd been pretending. Daniel was at peace with his choices, with the new life he'd carved for himself. And as I stood there watching him walk away, I realized I wasn't. I wasn't ready to let go of what we once had. Not because I wanted him back, not exactly, but because there was still something broken inside of me, something I hadn't even noticed until this moment. The days that followed felt like they passed in a blur. I found myself restless at work, distracted by thoughts of Daniel and the paths we'd taken. I poured myself into my nonprofit, burying my energy in causes that needed me, but even there, something was missing. I couldn't find satisfaction in the work anymore. There was a hollow feeling I couldn't fill with good deeds and earnest efforts. In the evenings, I'd sit on the couch replaying our conversation in my mind, the things I'd said to him, the way I'd tried so hard to be someone I thought I was supposed to be. And every time, I came back to the same question. Why couldn't I let go of what wasn't mine anymore? One Thursday night, a few weeks after the coffee date, I found myself at the office late, reviewing proposals and budgets when the phone rang. I looked down at the screen, seeing that it was his number. My heart skipped a beat, but I hesitated, unsure of why he would be calling. I answered, the words falling from my lips before I could stop them. "Daniel." "Hey," he said, his voice familiar but with a slight edge of hesitation. "I didn't mean to leave things weird between us. I just wanted to check in." "I don't know. It's been a while." I leaned back in my chair, trying to focus on the present moment, trying to keep my voice even. "No, it's okay. I've been thinking about everything too." We both fell into a quiet rhythm, speaking about the mundane things first, the weather, work, some mutual friends. But the undercurrent of what had happened between us remained, silent but palpable. Finally, I asked, "What's going on, Daniel? Why the sudden check-in?" He paused, and I could hear the weight of his thoughts in the silence. "I don't know. I guess I wanted to know if you were okay, for real. Not just, the face you show everyone else. How are you really doing?" How was I really doing? The question rattled me. For so long I'd been playing this, part of a woman who had it all together, of someone who had moved on from a messy, broken marriage. But the truth was, I wasn't okay. I wasn't okay at all. I'm not doing as well as I thought I was, I admitted, my voice small. "I thought I could handle everything, Daniel. But something feels off, and I keep pushing, trying to fill it with work and the cause, but it's not enough. I don't even know what I'm looking for." "I think you're looking for yourself," he said softly. "And maybe it's time to stop pretending you have everything figured out. I know it's hard. I know you want to have the answers. But sometimes it's okay to just be lost." His words, simple as they were, felt like a revelation. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. I hadn't been living for me. I'd been living for others, for the nonprofit, for the people around me, and I'd never taken the time to just be. The days after that call unfolded slowly, in a way that felt both liberating and terrifying. I found myself taking long walks through the park in the evenings, allowing myself to feel the things I had buried for so long: anger, sadness, confusion. There was a release in it, a sense of letting go without having to hold on to something that no longer fit. I'd taken on so much in an attempt to prove that I was okay, that I could rise above my mistakes, my choices. But in the silence, in the rawness of those moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I saw clearly. I was still haunted by what I had lost. Not just Daniel, but the life I could have had. The version of myself that had been swallowed up by ambition, by fear, and by pride. I wasn't ready to forgive myself yet. I wasn't ready to forgive him either, not fully. But I knew now that healing wasn't a destination. It was an ongoing process. And maybe, just maybe, I needed to spend more time figuring out who I was before I could consider what came next. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was running from the inevitable. I was standing still, letting the pieces fall where they may. Chapter 7. Tides of Change. The weeks that followed the call with Daniel were a steady current, pulling me through the motions of my life. There was something comforting about routine, about the familiar, a way to mask the churning within. I'd shifted my focus at the nonprofit, taking on new projects that, while demanding, provided an anchor for the storm I was learning to navigate inside myself. But even in my busiest hours, there was a weight I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just the ghost of Daniel that lingered in the corners of my thoughts, though that was certainly part of it. It was the feeling of being exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't been in years. He had broken down some of the walls I'd carefully constructed around my heart. His words, "You're looking for yourself," echoed constantly, a reminder that the woman I thought I'd become wasn't the woman I was truly meant to be. One night, as the city lights twinkled below from my apartment window, I found myself staring at the phone, debating whether or not to reach out. Should I call him again? But the question wasn't simple, and the answer was even more complicated. After that one phone call, I had felt a flicker of something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Connection. Not to Daniel, the man I had been married to, but to Daniel, the person I remembered him to be, the person I used to feel safe with, the person I used to talk to about everything and nothing. Was it possible to rekindle that without it turning into the same disaster that led to our divorce in the first place? My phone buzzed in my hand, breaking the silence. I looked down, startled, seeing a text message from an unknown number. My pulse quickened as I unlocked the screen, trying to prepare myself for whatever it might say. Emma, it's Daniel. I know you're probably going to think this is strange, but I just wanted to let you know I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I never really gave you the chance to explain things, and I know I wasn't fair to you. If you're open to it, I'd like to talk. Maybe we can meet up for coffee again. The simplicity of his words, the sincerity I could feel in the text, struck me harder than I expected. It had been so long since I'd heard from him, and yet reading those lines felt like a key unlocking a door I hadn't realized I'd still been keeping shut. I stared at the screen for a long while, the words spinning in my mind. What do I want from this? I wasn't sure. But what I was certain of was that I hadn't fully processed our past. I hadn't let myself feel the depth of the betrayal, the anger, or the heartbreak. In all these months, I had been trying to avoid the emotions tied to him, to keep him locked away in the past. But maybe, just maybe, I could confront it now. Maybe I can make peace with it all. I typed out a response, my fingers trembling, slightly as I wrote. I think we both deserve some closure, Daniel. Let's meet. The message was simple, but in it, I felt the weight of 1,000 unsaid words, the tentative hope of understanding. I wasn't sure where this path would lead, but the very act of opening the door felt like a quiet rebellion against the walls I had so carefully built. We met 2 days later at the same cafe where we'd shared our last conversation, a place that held so much history for us. It was as though time had bent, drawing us back to that moment, even though everything had changed. He was sitting at the same corner table, his back to the window, his posture just as relaxed as I remembered. He didn't seem to have changed much, but I knew that wasn't true. Neither of us were the same people we had been when we last spoke. I took a deep breath and walked toward him, my heart racing in my chest. His gaze lifted, and for a second, the world around us seemed to fade into the background. Emma, he said, standing up and offering a small, uncertain smile. Thanks for agreeing to meet. Of course, I said, my voice quiet. I sat across from him, taking in the familiar scent of his cologne, the way his hand rested on the table, relaxed yet heavy with unspoken tension. It felt like we were strangers again, but not entirely. There was an awkward pause, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. But then Daniel broke the silence, his voice low, filled with sincerity. I've been thinking about us a lot, he began. About everything. About how I handled things. I wasn't fair to you, Emma. I didn't give you the chance to explain, to really talk through everything. I just assumed too much. I couldn't help but laugh softly, though the sound was bitter. You assumed, all right, and I let you. I never stood up for myself. Daniel's eyes dropped to the table, regret swimming in them. You didn't deserve any of that. The way I treated you, I should have listened. You tried to warn me. You tried to make me see that things weren't working, but I was too wrapped up in myself. Chapter 8. Uncharted Waters. As the days passed after that meeting, the world seemed to shift around me. I couldn't quite explain it, but I felt like I was standing on the edge of something large and unknown. Daniel's apology hadn't fixed everything, nor had it cleared away the years of hurt, betrayal, and confusion. But it had given me something important, a sliver of hope. Not hope for a future with him, but hope for a future with myself, one where I could heal. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I would feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. The silence of my apartment felt louder in the absence of his presence, more suffocating than the world outside my walls. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. I didn't know what kind of person I was becoming. I spent more time at work, diving, into projects that made me feel grounded, like I had a purpose. It wasn't enough to numb the pain, but it helped keep the darkness at bay. But even in those moments when I was fully immersed in my work, my mind would wander to Daniel. What if I had done things differently? What if I had fought harder? Those questions plagued me more than I wanted to admit. And then there was Henry, the man I had begun to lean on, a friend, a confidant, a shoulder to cry on. He had been there for me through everything, offering a stability I had craved without even realizing it. He wasn't like Daniel. Henry was kind, patient, and understanding. He didn't carry the weight of our shared past. He was a fresh start. But even with Henry, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was using him as a distraction from my unresolved emotions. It was a Friday evening when I ran into Daniel again. I hadn't expected it, hadn't planned for it, but fate had its own agenda. I was picking up coffee from the cafe around the corner, the same place where we'd met a few weeks earlier. I had just stepped up to the counter when I heard his voice. "Emma?" I froze, turning slowly. There he was, standing at the door, his hands shoved into his pockets. His face was a mixture of surprise and something else, something deeper that I couldn't quite place. "Daniel," I said, forcing a smile that felt foreign on my lips. He looked at me, his expression hesitant, as if unsure whether to step, forward, or retreat. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice quiet but warm. "I didn't either," I replied, glancing around at the empty cafe, the awkwardness between us thick in the air. There was a long pause, the kind that stretched out like a slow-burning flame. I wondered if we were both waiting for something to happen, for the air between us to shift in some way. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. The question caught me off guard. I had expected pleasantries, small talk, or maybe even avoidance. But here was Daniel, asking about me in a way that felt real, like he genuinely cared. "I'm figuring it out," I said, a part of me surprised by the honesty in my voice. "It's complicated." "Yeah," he agreed, shifting uncomfortably. "I get it. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing." I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. Why was I suddenly so afraid to speak? "I've been thinking about our conversation," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "And about everything that's happened. I'm not sure I can just forgive it all, but I do think it's good to talk." He nodded, his eyes softening. "I'm glad. I don't want to be the person who makes everything harder for you. But I also don't want you to feel like we can't have a real conversation, you know?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. We're both still healing. And maybe that's okay. "I don't know what I want from you anymore, Daniel," I said, finally speaking the truth I'd been hiding. "I'm not looking for something to fix me. I'm not even sure what I'm looking for, but I think I need to find it on my own." He studied me for a long moment, as if searching for something in my eyes. "I understand," he said quietly. "You don't owe me anything. I just wanted to be here, in case you needed me." The words were kind, but they didn't fix anything. They didn't change the past or the mistakes we'd made, but they felt like the beginning of something. Not of us. No, I knew better than to believe that. But of me. a chance for me to finally move forward. Later that night, I sat on my couch, replaying the interaction in my mind. Daniel had left the cafe with nothing more than a lingering glance, leaving me to ponder his words. I just wanted to be here, in case you needed me. But the truth was, I didn't know what I needed anymore. I didn't know who I was supposed to be now. After everything that had happened, after the betrayal, after the divorce, after trying to rebuild my life, I wasn't the same person I was before him. I wasn't the same person I had been when we'd first met. Chapter 9. The Turning Point. The wine Henry brought that night was more than just a drink. It was a symbol of something I hadn't realized I'd been craving: stability, comfort, a way to settle into myself again without the weight of past mistakes constantly bearing down on me. We sat together on my couch, the soft, dim light of the lamps casting long shadows across the room. The world outside seemed far away, muted by the heavy curtains, leaving only the two of us in this cocoon of quiet. Henry poured the wine with careful precision, the red liquid swirling in the glass like it held secrets, like it could somehow reveal something about me that I wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. He offered me the glass, and I took it from him with a faint smile, feeling the cool stem of the glass in my hand. "Here's to figuring things out," he said, his voice warm but laced with a kind of knowing I hadn't expected. "To figuring things out," I repeated softly, my gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. My thoughts, though, were elsewhere. What does it mean to truly figure things out? To move forward when the past still clings to you like a shadow? We didn't need words for a while. We sat in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, but somehow the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like a space where we could exist together, without expectations or judgments. It was new, this feeling, being with someone without feeling like I was hiding pieces of myself. "I never asked you why you left," Henry said after a while, his voice breaking the stillness between us. His words landed in the air like a weight, heavy with the unspoken history that lay between us. I looked at him, his face soft in the low light, his eyes gentle as they met mine. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking because he wanted to understand, because he wanted to know me. I took a breath, feeling the weight of my past press against my chest. Do I really want to say it out loud? "I left because I couldn't keep pretending," I said quietly, my fingers tracing the rim of the glass. "I couldn't keep living in a lie. With Daniel, I didn't want to be the person who stayed out of fear, out of obligation." Henry's eyes never wavered from me. "And now?" I swallowed, the answer stuck in my throat. "And now? What?" "I don't know," I confessed. "I thought I did. I thought I had everything figured out. But it's like I'm walking through fog. The path ahead isn't clear." His hand reached out, resting gently on mine. The warmth of his touch seeped through me, grounding me in the moment. It wasn't a touch of urgency or desperation. It was simple, steady. "You don't have to know everything now, Emma," he said, his voice steady and sure. "You're allowed to just be, to take the time you need. I'm here, whenever you're ready, whatever that looks like." His words unraveled something inside me. The tension in my chest eased just a little. For the first time in what felt like ages, I didn't feel like I was running a race against time. I didn't have to rush to fix everything, to make everything okay again. Maybe that was the hardest lesson I'd ever had to learn. Later that night, after a few more glasses of wine, Henry left with a soft kiss on my cheek, a gesture so tender, it almost felt like a promise. And as I watched him walk away, the door closing quietly behind him, I stood in the hallway for a moment, taking in the weight of the night. I felt lighter in some ways, but also heavier in others. The fog inside me hadn't fully lifted. There were still days ahead that would be hard, days that would bring me back to those dark places where memories of Daniel haunted me. But tonight, for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again, like I was allowed to exist, imperfect and uncertain, without apology. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't expected. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft, golden beams across the room. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on me. I didn't feel like I was racing to fix everything. I didn't feel like I was drowning in the past. I made coffee, taking my time with it. Each step in the process, grinding the beans, boiling the water, watching the steam rise from the mug, felt like an act of reclaiming myself. A slow, deliberate act of rebuilding. I didn't need anyone else to validate my existence. I was enough, just as I was. As I sipped my coffee, I pulled out my phone, scrolling through messages. There were a few from my mom checking in on me, some from friends asking how I was doing. But then, one message stood out. It was from Daniel. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep moving forward without looking back. But there was another part of me, the part that wanted answers, the part that wanted to finally put the past to rest.